I have this perennial problem. Every year, I have to get someone to introduce Joseph Pearce. And I ask around this year. I don't know. No one wants to introduce Joseph Pearce. I asked Dale, if he would do it, and he said, "Lou, to quote Cardinal Newman, nothing doing." Last year, with tears in my eyes, I caught John Finucane in a moment of weakness and asked him, and he consented to introduce Joseph Pearce. My hand to God, I forgot that John was Irish. And so you saw how that went, and we can't do that again. So I figured, fine, okay, that's enough. I'll do it myself. There's this theory about Shakespeare, the Oxfordian theory. There's a lot of theories about who wrote Shakespeare, who really wrote this. Come on, you're not talking about. So one of the big ones is the Oxfordian theory that Edward de Vere, I guess the Earl of Oxford, actually wrote these under a pen name and then, slipped them under the Shakespeare pen name. And of course, they've got spectacular evidence on it, like Shakespeare's name was misspelled a few different ways, and a couple of things, convincing evidence. And of course, some of the reasons they give, though, are kind of interesting. It's kind of like Shakespeare was an actor, and what actor could write like this? And of course, you wouldn't know that unless you ever acted Shakespeare on stage, and then only an actor could write like that. But that's different. There's things like, well, he didn't have a higher education, which the Earl of Oxford did, and Shakespeare wasn't, well known in court circles. Elizabeth and that wonderful man, Lord Cecil, they didn't really know Shakespeare, and of course they knew the Earl of Oxford. So it's kind of like, okay, it's pretty obvious to these people, and it's obvious to anyone who doesn't pay much attention to facts and doesn't really know theater at all, that the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare. It's in this same spirit that I'm going to propose a theory that I first proposed 7 years ago, and no one took me seriously. I'm the voice of one whining in the wilderness. Are we to really believe that this next speaker has written all these books? That's... Well, you have to look at the facts. He doesn't have a higher education. He's got this strange past as a thug in London and skinhead. And he does like 68 talks a month in different places, and supposedly. So I kind of wanted to bring in some evidence, and I want you to decide. I guess I want to plant the seeds of doubt. We can't resolve this here today. It'll take a lot of people with advanced degrees to figure this one out. He's got this book on chess, this wonderful book, absolutely marvelous book called Wisdom and Innocence, and it's a biography of Chesterton, and it's masterful. And whoever did write this just really knew Chesterton, loved Chesterton, and it's a book well worth owning and well worth reading. And sometimes marking up pages that you sort of like. Tolkien, Man and Myth. Now, this is a marvelous book about Tolkien. Again, the same guy wrote this, and Chesterton and Tolkien, that's maybe plausible, but let's keep going. You got this book, Literary Converts, and the writer goes back all the way to the 18-ish 80s up until Malcolm Muggeridge is the last character he talks about. And it's truly amazing stories about literary and artistic converts to the faith, and many of who were touched by Chesterton. And it's just got some great tales in it, and it's marvelously written, and so well done. A book on Solzhenitsyn that makes you want to run home and read some Solzhenitsyn, Soul in Exile, by a writer who actually interviewed and talked with Solzhenitsyn. A book on Oscar Wilde that makes you want to run home and not read Oscar Wilde. But truly, it would make you appreciate Oscar Wilde, and it's truly quite a marvelously written book. Book on, come on, is anybody buying C.S. Lewis in the Catholic Church? Okay, so he's got a book on a problem that we know of. It's like C.S. Lewis himself brought a lot of people in the Catholic Church, but didn't come himself. So what was the struggle? So, I mean, and this is a marvelous book itself. Old Thunder, a book on Hilaire Belloc. Again, this is a lot of books from one guy. Two books on Shakespeare as Catholic. The Quest for Shakespeare, which really goes into the history of the whole Catholic theory of Shakespeare, which is the most plausible one going, and then Through Shakespeare's Eyes, which takes you to plays. Of course, this would give the Oxfordians something else to work with. If Shakespeare was a Catholic, he couldn't have written those plays. And a book he's going to talk about today called Small is Still Beautiful, Economics as If Families Mattered. And, if you think back into the 70s, this is really kind of continuing the work done by Schumacher in his book Small is Beautiful back a number of years ago. Okay, so we got economics, we got history, we got literature, we got, these biographies. It's like, and then, you pick up an occasional book here and there, The Abbess of Andalusia, it's forward or prefaced by Joseph Pearce. You pick up, J.R.R. Tolkien's Bradley Bird's forward by Joseph Pearce, and you read Star Magazine, and it's supposedly the same guy is the editor of Star Magazine. I think I have a case to make. Okay. Now, we've had this guy back a number of years here, this next speaker, and he's a charming fellow. It's hard to believe that anybody with that accent would really write these books, but that's a whole different matter. But my theory is that I think I've opened up a conspiracy kind of thing. There's a number of people writing these books as Joseph Pearce, and I'm not kidding. And this is the front guy. They send him out to do the dirty work and mix with the public. Meanwhile, back there in Florida, wherever he's from, they're tippy-typing away even as we speak. Without further ado, I just one request, Joseph, if you kind of keep it short this afternoon, because I'm working on some bookshelves at home, and I want to have a little extra time to finish them off. But please welcome Joseph Pearce. Let me get this out of your way.
You better get out of my way. Well, thank you for that very interesting conspiracy theory. I'm quite pleased, actually, that I've been coming back here for 7 years, and it's only this year he's realized. It shows I'm quite good at the job. But I do have to put the record straight here. There's not a committee that writes my books. The author of my books is actually Richard Dawkins, the famous... His front is brilliant. You would never believe he wrote those books, would you? Because it's so. But you're sworn to secrecy. No one outside this room must know that. Actually, Dale's talk this morning about smoking. It reminded me of a story that someone told me about their mother or something. It's an Irish woman, and she chain smokes 40 a day or something. And she's visiting her daughter, and she's smoking away, huffing. And her little granddaughter comes in from school, and she's 6 or 7 years old, sees her grandmother smoking, and says, "Granny, you shouldn't be doing that. We've just had a no smoking day at school, and all about how bad it is. You shouldn't really be smoking." And the granny went, "In my day, fornication was a sin." Anyway, small is still beautiful. Dale spoke about big business, big government. I'm going to be speaking about big business and big government, what the Catholic Church calls subsidiarity, what Chesterton and Belloc call distributism. But I want to give a little background information, first of all, about how I came to this philosophy, if you like. And first of all, it was, a few years back, since I've been coming back here every year forever, and I don't know how many of you have been here year after year, but a few years back, I can't really remember, it might have been last year, it might have been 5 years ago, I've lost all track, but I did give my conversion story. And so I'm not going to go over all of that, but you will remember, perhaps, if you were here, that I was involved in radical, extremist, racist politics. And we had the communists as our enemies, and they used to attack us on the streets and throw things at us, including insults. They used to throw insults at us. And one of them was that you fascists are just the stormtroopers of capitalism. And this is what set out my own quest for an alternative to, because my attitude was, look, I don't like communism. I'm never going to like communism. I can see what communism is. In reality, it's big government, big brother, and mass executions, tyranny. But that doesn't mean I want the world run by Bill Gates and Microsoft. I mean, Bill Gates and Microsoft weren't around then, but I can't think now what the 1980s equivalent would be. So I started looking, and someone said, have you read about the distributist ideas of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc? Of course, I hadn't. And I started reading. This person said I needed to read Chesterton's book, The Outline of Sanity, which I did, and an essay by him called Reflections on a Rotten Apple, which I did. But of course, this, what I was being introduced to, as well as these wonderful ideas about distributism, was Catholicism. And this was the beginning of my path to conversion. So this politics and economics, if you like, was what brought me to the Catholic faith, at least set me on the path towards conversion. And I think this is important because this political philosophy, which is embraced by the church, I think has great evangelical power and potential. It's a great way of bringing people to the church. And I think that in some ways it's been called the church's best kept secret. And I think it's because certain neocons think it's best kept secret. That we just don't talk about this, or we get embarrassed about it. But let's quickly, I want to go through the essential ingredients here, but I just want to give some heritage. So Chesterton and Belloc. And of course, Belloc, when he started writing about distributism as it became known, was himself inspired by the papal encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, published in 1891. Belloc's early pamphlets on this was The Church and Socialism, and The Church and the Principle of Private Property. And these were a response to the social encyclicals of the Catholic Church, particularly Rerum Novarum. So we have the papacy and the church and its social teaching, its social doctrine, as, if you like, the beginning of it. Chesterton and Belloc take up the banner. So I discovered Chesterton and Belloc. I then also discovered a German thinker who no one's heard of, but I'm going to mention him anyway, called Otto Strasser. And he was for a while in the Nazi party. His brother, Gregor Strasser was actually Hitler's number 2 and would be murdered on the night of the Long Knives in 1934. But Otto Strasser got disillusioned with the Nazis before then, I think before the Nazis came to power even, I think. But anyway, he dropped out of the Nazi party and then formed an organization called the Schwarz Front, the Black Front, which was an underground secret society of members of the Nazi party who were opposed to Hitler and who actually espoused something which is very similar to the church's social teaching, which is not surprising because Otto Strasser's younger brother, his older brother Gregor, was Hitler's number 2, but his younger brother became a Benedictine monk. And he taught something such called Usufruct, sometimes translated as entail, which is very similar to Chesterton and Belloc's idea on distributism. And then I discovered Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher, which in 1973 was an international bestseller. You don't get books of economics, don't normally sell millions of copies, but this did. And it had a profound cultural and political impact. In some ways, you know, it was the founder of the modern environmental movement, for good or ill. And, you know, President Carter, Jimmy Carter, invited Schumacher to the White House, and I had a photo op with him in the White House because these ideas were very fashionable. But what people didn't realize is that Schumacher himself was hugely influenced by the social teaching of the Catholic Church in his formulating of the ideas for Small is Beautiful, and that indeed 2 years before Small is Beautiful was published, he was received into the Catholic Church and was a Catholic convert. Many of Schumacher's followers would have been horrified to discover that. And indeed, the Schumacher Society today is full of wacky New Age witches and what have you. I've heard some horror stories about their last meeting somewhere in the States, all this wacky New Age stuff, and they are trying to hide, ignore the fact that Schumacher was a Catholic. But so we see, and then of course now, more recently, with John Paul II, with his encyclical Centesimus Annus, and then Pope Benedict with his encyclical Caritatis in Veritate, have reiterated the Church's teaching, and the buzzword really for all this is subsidiarity. And subsidiarity really is that the family is sacrosanct, the family is the smallest unit, but also should be the most powerful unit in terms of economics and politics. And that usurpation of power away from the family is the root of much of what's wrong with the world. So let's look at this. Ultimately, for me, I think, and for Catholics, and for Christians, and for anybody with any common sense, when you go to vote in an election, obviously whether the candidate believes that it's okay to kill babies has to take priority. We can't in conscience vote for someone that thinks killing babies is okay. But after that's resolved, the next thing is, where does this person stand on big government and big business? Does this person believe in smaller government, and does he believe in promoting small businesses or not? So it's something we have to be aware of. Because let's get one thing straight here. The myth used to be that you have to choose between the big business of capitalism or the big government of socialism. That was the choice. But in actual fact, of course, what we really have is not big business or big government and a choice between them. We have big business and big government. We have literally the worst of both worlds. We have globalization, of course, and the globalism that goes with it. And we have a federal government that becomes more and more powerful with every year that passes, grabbing more power to itself, usurping the powers of the local states. On a global level, we have globalist institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, globalist institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Union, all of which are concentrating more and more power into fewer and fewer hands. And let's get one thing straight, by the way. We need to realize that democracy is not just having a vote. Because you can have a vote and be completely powerless. So, for instance, in the European Union, one member of the European Parliament represents several million voters. And he's one voice in a sea of hundreds of members of the European Parliament, and most of the real work done in the European Union is done by the European Commission, which is unelected anyway. It's a profoundly undemocratic system, and the European Union is usurping power all the time away from the nation states. So we'll have a United States of Europe. This is not democratic. And of course, the European Union is a perfect example of big government and big business as bedfellows, because the European Union is very socialist, and yet it's very much in bed with multinational corporations. So big, in terms of government or business, is undemocratic. And that true democracy only works on a small scale. And we have to actually realize, and have the courage to realize and say, that we are not living in a democratic country. We're living in a country that's becoming less and less democratic with every year that passes. And if we want to live in a democratic country, we have to insist that real power is given back at grassroots level, which is real power being given back to families, but also real power being given back to local government. And that the issues concerning the local area have to be left to the local government, and there's no right for the national government or the state government to get involved at a local level. And of course, this would make things really democratic, because you would know the person you're voting for. You would have that person answerable for things happening locally, and if they didn't do their job, you would get them out next election. And on the other hand, if you wanted something done, you'd badger them. I think it was our friend Mr. Chesterton earlier that talked about if the women want to get what they want, they should just nag. You can't nag the European Union. It's a giant and you're an ant. But you can nag your local representative. You don't bother to nag your local representative because your local representative has no power, so what's the point? But if your local representative did have power, you would nag him. And you would get things done. So we need a radical rethink on what exactly democracy is. Also, ultimately, the big global thing that we're in now is unsustainable. There is no strategy. It's all about instantaneous gratification and instantaneous profit. Globalization is just a reckless race in the direction of maximizing wealth with no strategy, no forethought. And of course, as everything gets bigger and bigger and bigger, its collapse is going to be more and more catastrophic. I'll give you one example here. One of the laws of conventional economics is something called comparative advantage. And the idea of comparative advantage is that we should, in the so-called developed world, we should stop manufacturing goods. Because, in the Pacific Rim, where labor costs are lower, it's cheaper to make them there. And therefore, we can have cheap imports coming in, the cost to the consumer will come down, it makes all sorts of economic sense. What we need to do is to concentrate on the service industries. That's what we excel at. So it's all about comparative advantage. We do what we're good at, let the Indians and the Chinese do what they're good at, we import their manufactured goods. Well, the trouble with that is that the same argument for labor costs applies to service industries as it does to manufacturing industries. And you've seen already global corporations relocating their major administrative operations to the Pacific Rim, to the Third World, because it's cheaper to employ people there than it is here. So what's left, ultimately, if this comparative advantage is taken to its logical conclusion? The only parts of the economy that would be left here are things such as healthcare. And that's a boom industry at the moment, obviously, under Obama. Healthcare and education. Now think about that, because you can't ship that out. You can't send all your children off to Pakistan to be educated every day, and nor can you go to China when you've got an earache. So, so that's got to stay here. But that's the part of the economy that doesn't make money. That's the part of the economy that costs money. So what's happening is we are shipping out the whole economic infrastructure of the United States, the same thing could be said, by the way, of Europe, to the Pacific Rim, to what used to be called the Third World. Our manufacturing base is being shipped out, our service industries are being shipped out, and we're going to be left with, obviously plumbers will be here because you can't send your broken toilet to China either. So there'll be some jobs like that, but basically education, the healthcare, all these things that are great drains on the wealth of the nation is what will be left. So, we can get a lot of wisdom from old wives' tales and truisms, and we've all heard the phrase, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And of course, the first lesson of the mania towards centralization is that's what we're doing. We're putting all our eggs in one basket so that one basket gets dropped and you've got a lot of broken eggs. So that's true, but we've got to much further than that. Because what we've done with the US economy over the last 30 years or more, we put all of our eggs in other people's baskets. And now, if we don't expect, I've talked about eggs, our chickens to come home to roost, I think we're in for a nasty surprise. The other thing about the modern economy, and there was a very, very good talk given at the Chesterton Conference in Minnesota, not the one in St. Paul, the one north, by an economist, showing how the whole recent meltdown was the consequence in large part to the fact that the economy is driven by debt. Now, everything in our economy is debt-driven. Now, even dollar bills are actually lent to interest into circulation. Now, what that means, of course, is that an economy has to expand just to stay where it is. Now, if you have to pay back compound interest on the debt, you've got to be having economic growth just to stay where you are. And so this inherent debt factor puts a burden on the economy that has to forever not be stable in the sense of just being what it is, has to be always pursuing growth at all costs just to stop a slump. It's unsustainable. The other thing, of course, ultimately, as in most things, ultimately all things, it's a question of morality. We live in a society now that makes a virtue of greed, makes a virtue of buying things you don't need, makes a virtue of buying things with built-in obsolescence that are designed to go wrong very quickly, so you have to buy them again. No, Mahatma Gandhi said, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And greed, of course, because it's a sin, is eternal, as are its consequences. In other words, there's no limit. And my father used to tell me, he said, these sort of earthy wisdom my father used to give me. He says, when you go out, can you imagine this, giving this information, this advice to a 9-year-old? You can see why I went astray. He says, when you get older, son, he says, if you have to choose between being a drunk or a gambler, he said, be a drunk. I said, okay, Dad. And he said, because there's a limit to how much you can drink. There's no limit to how much you can gamble. So there's a limit to our needs. There's no limit to our greed. We can always want more. So that's why, for me, that's sort of the mantra of the culture in which we live is the Rolling Stones song. You all know, I'm not going to do my Mick Jagger impersonation, you're very pleased to know. I can't get no satisfaction. No, it's a phrase which is not just negative, it's double negative. I can't get no satisfaction, which of course literally grammatically, as our reading professor will tell us, means that he's satisfied. But if you know that's not what he means, he can't be satisfied. And the word satisfaction comes from the Latin satis, which means enough. You can't get enough. And we are always being told in our culture that of course you don't have enough. No one ever has enough. You want more. And Schumacher, a large part of Schumacher's book ultimately was, if you want to have a sound economy, if you want to have a sustainable economy, a healthy economy, it has to be rooted in virtue, not least of which are the cardinal virtues of temperance and prudence. When was the last time you saw a commercial on television urging you to be temperate in your taste? Don't buy this. You don't need this. Buy a cheaper model. Or to be prudent. Are you sure you can afford this? No, we're advertising it, but be sure you can afford it first. Check your bank balance. It's on the contrary, it's pushing us towards, of course you're not satisfied with the car you have now. Get this new one. And Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another great hero of mine in his political philosophy as well as just his life and his defiance of communism, spoke about at the heart of any healthy economy has to be self-limitation. I think it'd be Chesterton's words, what's wrong with the world? I am. No, that we need to realize that every single day of our lives we're either part of the problem or part of the solution. And we have to self-limit, we have to practice the virtues of prudence and temperance and persuade others to do likewise. And let me just throw a few words of wisdom here from certain people. Edmund Burke, a favorite amongst conservatives, says, liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. Liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. It's a good Chestertonian paradox, that anarchy ultimately does not lead to freedom but to slavery. And this is important because the libertarians argue that we have to have nothing interfering with the free market. If we had a truly free market, everything would be wonderful. Well, the first thing is, there's no such thing as the free market. The free market's always being tampered with, influenced. The commercials we spoke about are interfering with the free market. Economies of scale interfere with the free market. The way that big business unfairly pushes and keeps small business out of the marketplace. Taxation, subsidization, tariffs. So the free market is a myth. So that being so, nonetheless, market forces are good, competition is good, within limits. Liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. Another, Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So we live in a world where entities, political and economic, are getting bigger and bigger. Government's getting bigger. Business is getting bigger. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That we're going to be ruled by people who are further and further away from us, further and further divorced from our needs, our wants. One of my favorite paradoxes is a line from a poem by Oscar Wilde. Anarchy, freedom's own Judas. And of course, another Oscar Wilde quote, "The cynic is the person who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." Now that actually sums up the market-driven mentality, where the value, there is no such thing as a value. It's the price, what it can be sold for or bought for. And Chesterton, God bless Chesterton. I think, I'm going to get my facts wrong probably, you can correct me later, but I think it was in one of his North American tours, and I think he gave this talk in several places, but I know he gave it in Canada, perhaps in Toronto, and it might have been 1931. But he gave a talk called Culture and the Coming Peril. And bear in mind, this is 1931. The Bolshevik Revolution had happened 14 years earlier. The Nazis were on the verge of coming to power. Totalitarianism was a real presence. And Chesterton says, I expect many of you think I'm going to talk about the coming peril as Bolshevism. He says, but I'm not, because I don't think Bolshevism is a coming peril. Because the best way of destroying a utopia is to try it. Again, wonderful. You want to destroy communism, put it in practice and see how unworkable it is. So great words of prophecy, because not many people believed that in 1931. In actual fact, the reason fascism grew and communism grew in the 1930s was people thought you had to choose one or the other. Either communism or fascism is going to win, so whichever one you like least, will you support the other side. So Chesterton was very much a prophet then. He also said, by the way, in the same context, some people think that I think that George Bernard Shaw is a coming peril. Heavens no, he's a disappearing pleasure. But what Chesterton did say, what the coming peril was standardization by a low standard. Or to use our modern vulgar vernacular, the dumbing down of everything. And that's been one of the consequences of the economic and political system we live under, is the dilution and dumbing down of everything, and not least of all education, with the destruction of the liberal arts at the core, utilitarianism, so-called, taking over. But what do we do about it? Let's be practical. Well, Chesterton again. Chesterton said that conservatism seems to mean, to many people, doing nothing. He said, but doing nothing is not conserving it. If you do nothing with something, you are condemning it to decay. And he uses the example of a fence post. He says, if you want to preserve or conserve a fence post, you have to be continually painting it. If you don't paint it, it will rot, decay, fall down. And so will your fence. So in other words, in order to get what we want, in order to get subsidiarity, in order to get the family back at the center of a healthy culture and a healthy economy and a healthy politics, we have to do something. I want to give you a practical example here, one of my favorite doing something stories. It's a chapter in my book, Small is Still Beautiful. And I love this because it just shows what people can do. 4 Englishmen in a pub in Ireland. Sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? Yeah. It's like the priest, the rabbi, and the minister walk into a pub, and the landlord of the pub says, "Is this some kind of a joke?" Anyway, 4 Englishmen in the pub in Dublin, and they're rather melancholy, almost crying into their Guinness. And what causes this melancholy is the fact that you cannot get a decent pint of ale anywhere in England. that the English pint, English ale was dead. And the reason for this was since the Second World War, the big four brewers had bought up all the small breweries or otherwise forced them out of business and only bought the small brewers up in order to put them out of business. In other words, just to close them down. They might keep one of the labels for a while. So in the end, there were four major breweries producing mass-produced chemical fizz, masquerading as ale. I was just about old enough to remember it. It was horrible. Also, so I won't give all the details, but it was just terrible, right? This is a major part of culture, obviously. And again, the so-called free market, the big business interfered with the free market to stop consumers getting what they wanted by putting small competitors out of business. And they also, the big brewers, owned the pubs. And the small few brewers that were left had no outlet for their product because the brewers said, you're not allowed to sell anything except our beer in our pubs. And this is a perfect example of a subsidiarist law being passed, which is good. A law was passed in Parliament saying that every pub landlord, regardless of who owned the pub, had a right to sell a guest ale. So it freed up one of the hand pumps for a guest ale. And that gave the small brewers inroads into the market. But anyway, back to these four men crying in their Guinness. So they decide, rather than doing nothing, to start the campaign for real ale. They go back to England. It's 1974, I think, early 70s. And within 2 or 3 years, they have about 30,000 members. This becomes a major consumer pressure group. But better than that, some of these members campaign for real ale say, well, let's do something. Let's not just be putting pressure on. Let's start our own breweries. And so there was this new springtime, to quote Newman. I don't think he was talking about ale at the time, but it's this new springtime for English ale. With all these new, dozens of new breweries being set up and this wonderful new ale. And of course, when people started tasting this, they didn't want the chemical fizz. And so this has taken off. And then some of these small brewers decided to become beer consultants, and they travel around the world, including to the United States, to show people how to set up small breweries. And you will have noticed a microbrew revolution in this country. You can't go to any city of any size in the United States now without there being at least one small brewery. So this is 4 men in a pub in Dublin have created this change for the better in culture. So we can affect things, impact things. The other thing is we need to think about is appropriate technology. I'll give you a perfect example about big versus small. Schumacher. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, they finance these mega-billion-dollar schemes in the third world, in the developing world. Of course, by lending money to these these poor governments at interest that they then find great difficulty in paying back, to build, for instance, a nuclear power station on the outskirts of Delhi in India. The consequences of that are the impoverished villages. All the men leave the villages to go to the big city. Huge shanty towns arise outside these cities. This huge construction project employing thousands of people. Meanwhile, families have been separated. The husband's now living 100 miles from his family. The lifeblood of the villages has completely disappeared. And of course, when the construction project's finished, everyone's out of work. Probably marriages are in trouble. Schumacher says, for the same amount of money that it cost to build that nuclear power station, you could build an electric generator in 10,000 villages to provide electricity locally so that local industry could grow, families could stay together, people would be employed sustainably. In other words, you wouldn't, when the project's over, everyone's out of work. No, you're creating something which is permanent. It's what became known as intermediate or appropriate technology. And Schumacher's very influential in this. Cooperatives. Now, what happens? Okay, well, that's fine. Small businesses are wonderful. We like the whole romance of small family businesses, and we love the romance of nice, happy families. But in reality, we'll be told, it doesn't work. What about some businesses that just have to be bigger? Economies of scale are real. Absolutely. Well, a priest in Spain, in the northern part of Spain, the Basque region, inspired by the papal encyclicals of the church, got together with some workers and founded a producers' cooperative, a workers' cooperative in the Mondragon region of Spain. Today, the whole of that region of Spain, one of the powerhouses of the Spanish economy, is run by producers' cooperatives. So large industries, but where the actual workers in the industry own it. And it's been going now, I think he started those up in the 1920s, 1930s, still going strong today. Large parts of the construction industry in Italy are run by producers' cooperatives. Small farmers, obviously, small farmers can't afford some of the great technology, but you get together a farmers' cooperative and you share the capital-intensive aspects. And when I was writing my book, Small is Still Beautiful, I visited the Scott Bader Commonwealth. This was a focus of Schumacher's book. It was a Quaker, Ernest Bader, decides because of his Christian principles he's going to give his company away. And everyone said, you're mad. He's just crazy, he's just going to go bankrupt. He produced, it's the polymer industry, so plastics. He gives his company to his employees over a period of time, and it's all done sort of sensibly. I thought, I wonder how they're doing now. So I went to visit them and I interviewed the people that running it, what have you. First of all, they have a philosophy to have a maximum size, which they've stuck to. I think it's 500 employees or something, which they stick to. They haven't gone beyond that. They said if they do need to expand, they'll start another cooperative. They're thinking about starting one up in France, but they'll start a new one rather than make this bigger. But not only is it still thriving, it's about the only company of that size that survived in the polymer industry, because all other small companies were basically bought out by big companies and no longer exist. So not only are these not just utopian that don't work, they are actually the only things that do work if you want to keep your company human scale. And then the other thing is, when you've got a big company and it's not a producer cooperative, you can still work for smallness within bigness, subsidiarity within the large workplace. And many of the big multinationals have adopted this as well. Schumacher again spoke about it this way. He said, as the company gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's like a juggler. Company's getting bigger, you get another ball to juggle, and another one, 12 balls, 13 balls. Doesn't matter how good a juggler you are, in the end you start dropping the balls. It's inefficient. He said, but what's really needed is for industry, big industry, to be like, not the metaphor of the juggler, but the metaphor of a man holding balloons. Whereas there are subsidiary functions within the company, and all that the manager does, all the CEO does, is hold them together. And that, again, has been tried, seemed to be a much more efficient way of doing things. And it's the same analogy as government. You know, more and more power in the hands of fewer and fewer people is bad, even in big business. So we need to make democracy democratic, which means we have to start lobbying for power to be decentralized down to the local level again. There's a chapter in my book, Making Democracy Democratic. And ultimately, of course, this is a philosophical and theological problem, as all these things are. And if we don't evangelize the culture and win hearts over to a better way of life, then we will fail. Because relativism, the prevailing philosophy, is ultimately hedonistic, self-gratification. Why would it be anything else? Because a relativist is that I am the center. I am the arbiter of truth. Nobody has a right to tell me what an objective truth is. I make the decisions. That makes you the god of your own cosmos. So you'll do what you like. Self-gratification and hedonism and relativism go hand in hand. Whereas Christianity, self-sacrifice, self-limitation, prudence, and temperance also go hand in hand. So ultimately, as the Holy Father was saying repeatedly during his trip to England last week, that secular fundamentalism, he didn't put it as bluntly as this, so I don't have his subtlety. Secular fundamentalism is deadly to the culture, to the politics, to the economics, to the environment. And ultimately, the world must repent or die of consumption. Self-consumed, it will consume itself. Small is good, small is beautiful, and if our civilization is going to survive, small is necessary. Thank you very much.